Welcome to Inside the Castle, the podcast that goes behind castle doors to have real conversations with real people about solving the nation's toughest challenges.
I'm going to be your host today, Aaron Snyder.
And I'm Angie Fryermuth.
In this episode, we're learning more about the Corps' authorization and appropriation process and what it really means. Here today, we have Amy Klein and Jaya Ghosh. Thank you both for joining us here today.
Thanks for having us.
We're excited to talk about the A's and A's.
Nice. I like that. But before we start talking about the A's and A's, could you tell us both a little bit about yourself and your role within the Corps? Amy, we'll start with you.
Happy to. So again, Amy Klein. I am Congressional Affairs Program Manager at Corps Headquarters. I manage the authorizations portfolio, which I'm excited to talk to you about today. I've been in this role for almost 3 years now. Prior to that, though, I served in a few different capacities with the Corps. I've been with the Corps for over 22 years. Biologist by training, background, undergrad in biology, a master's degree in environmental law and science. Worked for a long time in the regulatory program at headquarters, as well as a few different districts. Getting started in Rock Island District, actually, as an intern doing water quality work. So it's been a long and fun career with a lot of different opportunities. And so I'm excited to be serving the Corps in this newer capacity for the past few years.
And I am Jaya Ghosh. I manage the appropriations portfolio within the Corps, and I have also been with the Congressional Affairs team for about 3 years now. This is my first role within the Corps. I used to work for the Department of Transportation, specifically the Maritime Administration, doing a lot of interagency policy work. And so that's actually where I first got to interact with the Corps, with the navigation team. I worked across Coast Guard, NOAA, Department of Transportation, and other agencies in the maritime space. And that's where I shifted into congressional affairs, and then was a natural transition to the congressional affairs team here at Corps Headquarters. My background is more in geology and environmental studies, but I do it just because it's fun to play in the mud, and now really excited about working at this policy interface, which being part of the appropriations portfolio entails. And we'll get a little bit into this later, but just what does it mean to be an appropriations program manager? I know a lot of people at the Corps are called program managers, and so a lot of what Amy and I do is manage the relationships between our congressional staff at the committee level and Corps Headquarters to help them get the information they need to write their authorizations or appropriations bills.
Thank you for that. Now let's get into the meat of the conversation, which are the AAs, right? So we'll start with authorization. Can you tell us a little bit more about authorization and what it is, Amy?
Yeah, so authorization, a way to look at it is it's the permission we have from Congress to take certain actions, right? So perhaps it's an action related to a specific project, whether that's studying a project or construction of a project. Perhaps it's a direction we need to follow when performing studies or conducting operation and maintenance or executing one of our other missions. So it could even be instruction to provide a report or conduct the research needed to inform a report. So authorizations could really run the gamut. Anything we do has to have an authorization. But obviously, that's not all we need. Authorization is just the first step, which is why it's the first A, and it takes us to the second A for appropriations, which I'll turn over to my colleague Jaya to fill in.
Yeah, so it's helpful to have the permissions to do things, and then you need the money to be able to do them. And so that's where the appropriations comes in. And so appropriations are kind of a separate part of the tools that Congress enables us with to execute those authorities that have been given to us. And a helpful way that I've been taught, and we've been taught to think about how the A's and A's relate, is to think of them as like two parents. And so one parent gives you the rules. So they say, okay, yes, you can go buy ice cream. You're allowed to go buy ice cream. And then you go to the other parent and ask for money can I have the money to go buy the ice cream? And so you need both parents to be able to succeed in getting your ice cream, or a very large Army Corps of Engineers construction projects of locks and dams or other things.
That's great. I'm glad you used that ice cream analogy for us. I actually was going to go with Taylor Swift tickets or something for our audience that's probably Swifties, but like I'm sure we all have permission to go to a Taylor Swift concert, but I bet most of us don't actually have the appropriations or dollars to do so. So it seems to me like one might be a little harder to get than the other one, and getting both of your parents on the same page is always a challenge. So thinking about this from that like idea of parents, which parent do we have to ask for authorization and which would it be for appropriations, and how does that process work?
Yeah, so on the authorization side, we have two committees we work with on the one for Senate and one for House. No surprise there. So it's the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and then the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment.
And the parent with the money on the appropriations side are our appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate. The appropriations committees are divided into 12 subcommittees that fund all the different agencies and functions of the government. The specific subcommittee that funds civil works is energy and water development. And so lumped into that is the Bureau of Reclamation. They do a lot. They're a lot of our partners for water in the West. And the energy part is Department of Energy.
So I'm sure that these parents have an appropriate timeline that they work on. So can you tell us when the parents actually give us the permission on a typical year?
Yeah, so our authorizing committees, the ones granting us the permission for all the things, they generally work in 2-year cycles. So at least since 2014, we have gotten what's referred to as the Water Resources Development Act, passed every 2 years. It's usually in the latter half of an even numbered year that they pass it. So 2014, 16, 18, 20, 22, right? So 24 now they're working on it. And so they pass that, and it can come in a couple forms. Sometimes it can come as a standalone authorization, but oftentimes it might ride with other sorts of congressional activities. So it might be folded into the National Defense Authorization Act, like it was in 22, the NDAA. In 2020, it was actually folded into an appropriations bill as part of an omnibus. So it was sort of combined with that to get it passed. So it can come to us a few different ways, but usually the timing is the same as the latter half of an even numbered year.
On the appropriations side, the regular appropriations runs on an annual cycle to fund each fiscal year's worth of work. And so a fiscal year is October 1st through September 30th. In recent times, we have found that we don't often get appropriations on the 1st of October. And so like while we like to say regular order appropriations will come on October 1st, we often find ourselves under periods of what we call continuing resolutions. And so what we've seen as a trend in recent years is we're getting our annual appropriations later into the start of the fiscal year, whether it's December or even January or March, like we did this past year for our fiscal year FY24 appropriations. The annual appropriation cycle is kind of kicked off with the release of the president's budget every year. And so that's where the president proposes what he would like to see funded in the annual appropriations bill, followed by Congress developing their bills, and then the enactment of the bills, hopefully by October 1st, but usually much later. The one exception to that is supplemental appropriations, which the Corps has been really lucky to get a lot of in the last few years to enable kind of major funding of really large projects. Whether these supplemental appropriations, they're not tied to any cycle, but they're often in response to some kind of emergency or disaster like a hurricane where the Corps is responding to those activities, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was a huge push by the administration and Congress to really fund a lot of infrastructure across the nation.
I think that's helpful to understand the process. And I find it really interesting that the permission is a 2-year cycle and the money is a 1-year cycle. So maybe I guess it's easier to get the money than is the appropriation. I don't know. But it does also seem like we heard about the president's budget and informing kind of Congress for the appropriations side of things. But what happens with that first step? Like, how does the administration interact on the authorization process? And are there any conflicts in either of these processes between the executive branch of the administration and the Congress?
That's a great question. You should probably ask the Assistant Secretary of the Army's office to weigh in on.
I'll add a little bit more on the appropriations side. And instead of saying conflict, it's, I think, a difference of priority. So the administration has their priorities that drive them, and Congress has their own priorities or different priorities. Sometimes they're overlapping, sometimes they're different. I think the way people like to describe Congress is there's 535 members of Congress, and each of them basically act like their own small business with their own constituents that have their own interests and needs. The administration proposes their priorities on the appropriation side through the president's budget. And then Congress can either accept or reject pieces or all of that president's budget to build their own appropriations. And I think this is where we've seen the resurgence or return of earmarks or congressionally directed spending, community project funding, is because Congress, by the Constitution, has the power of the purse, but they felt that the administration was having too much influence about where that money was going. And so the return of earmarks was really about Congress saying, hey, we want money to go to these specific places. And so these 535 small businesses, after they get the president's budget, are able to add their priorities through specifically directed funding to, in the civil works portfolio, to specific studies, projects, O&M projects, reports, R&D initiatives that they really care about. And so that's where you see the balance between the administration is able to get their priorities, and then Congress is able to add their priorities in through earmarks, other carve-outs, and then the administration has some flexibility again in the work plan process, which is very unique to civil works as well.
And I'd like to just add maybe some more of the challenges on the authorization side. When we do get an authorization every 2 years, and it's coming usually in the latter part of the year, if folks are paying attention to the timeline, you might realize that it doesn't quite fit into the appropriations process, right? Where the Corps has already turned in its budget homework for the upcoming fiscal year when we get a new authorization. And these authorizations can be quite large, right? They can, WRDA 22 was 199 provisions of varying complexity. Some were project specific, some were a real paradigm shift in perhaps how we do business. And so there can be delays in implementation as we're working to identify funding and getting that funding lined up for the next budget cycle in order to roll out a provision, or perhaps a provision needs more specific implementation guidance, or it could require rulemaking, in which case it has to follow a certain timed process for getting in the Federal Register to perform that rulemaking. And so it doesn't always, we don't just get the permission and go. Some work really needs to be done to identify the priorities of the administration, given the funding we have, funding we don't have, and what we can do quickly versus what's going to require a more concerted effort.
Yeah, Amy, that was really helpful. And I think you brought up a really great point that I do want to emphasize. And I know this podcast, sponsors listen to this. And so it's not just Corps employees, but understanding that once you get that authorization, that timing is really important because there's already a budget cycle that's been going on. And if I understand it right, the Corps is working on multiple budget cycles at the same time. So Jaya, could you talk a little bit about how the timing of those budget cycles work out? Because you can't really just go from getting authorization to immediately hopping right into the next budget cycle. There is a time lag there that I think would be helpful for our sponsors and Corps staff to understand.
Yeah, so the Corps staff across our programs teams are working some sort of magic because they are working within like 3 fiscal years at any given time. And so we right now are in FY24. They are working on executing that FY24 funds to the best of their abilities, seeing those projects and studies forward. At the same time that we're executing FY24, we're defending the FY25 president's budget. So we're working with Congress through hearings, through technical information to help Congress write those bills for the FY25 appropriations. At the same time, the Corps is already working to propose and build of that FY26 information that helps inform what the president's budget will contain. And so we are 3 cycles deep, and someone has a time turner somewhere to be able to keep all of those things straight because they're related, and we're making decisions about FY26 that might be influenced by an FY25 bill that hasn't even been decided yet. And so it's a really complex dance that a lot of really smart people across the agency work on. And then you add in the nuance of like what's in FY26 could be influenced by anything that comes out in a WRDA bill in 24, 22. And so that's just another nuance of like, how do we keep up with something that might change a cost share or authorize a new project that could then be eligible for funding or budgeting?
All very good points. And I think you made a really good point, Erin. Our partners need to know that, authorization is great, but they do need that money from the other parent in order to make things really happen. So good conversation there. You mentioned earlier that earmarks have returned. And so how has this impacted the way the Corps approaches project capability?
Sure. So earmarks returned in FY22 after about a decade-long moratorium, and they returned with a different emphasis on benefits to communities. So in the House, earmarks are called community project funding because they're for the purpose of supporting communities. Because of that, there is a lot more emphasis on transparency, tangible benefits to communities, and it also means that the technical information that we provide as an agency has direct So earmarks have really changed the way that we do business between Congress and our agency, but even with our agencies and relationships with stakeholders and non-federal sponsors, there is a lot more communication that happens directly between our agency and Congress to support the information that they need to be able to fund earmarks at the levels that they're needed. And so this is, Angie, you asked this question about how does this change how we communicate capabilities? And the Corps' responsibility, both on the authorization side and appropriation side, is to provide technical communications and information to Congress. That is our job. So the information needs to be clear, accurate, and consistent because we are a technical agency delivering technical projects. This is, with the return of earmarks, terms such as capability, which are the amounts that can be obligated in any fiscal year, become a part of a larger political appropriations process. And so it's part of our role to be able to communicate very complex technical information about what projects need to move forward, to keep on track to Congress, who have different priorities. As we were talking about, they're small businesses, they want to deliver benefits to their communities. We really have a focus on, as part of this earmarks process, communicating technically defensible information, which, as part of the earmark cycle, members are now putting their names behind amounts that are going towards projects. Their Senator so-and-so wants to put $1 million to fund the project in their community, and they are now putting their reputation behind those projects. And so when the Corps' technical information changes because project conditions have changed, new circumstances require things that are more expensive or less expensive, it changes the way that a member brings benefits back to their community.
So I think one of the biggest issues, or I guess maybe the biggest changes with earmarks, isn't that we're changing how we share information or what the capability is. It's that there are just far more technical requests from Congress for information from us to help inform numbers for the appropriations of specific projects, where prior to earmarks, perhaps they just gave us a lump sum amount to divide up however we wanted. Now we have to, we're reporting numbers, and these numbers can be dynamic, and there can be periods of catch up where the numbers don't always line up through the entire budget cycle because we're getting new information that's causing us to tweak them. And they're working towards making sure the numbers always line up because they have their own ceiling they're working under. So there can be a lot more requests, a lot more pressure to provide as accurate of information as possible, even if we don't have all the information at the time. On the authorization side, it also comes in the form of a lot more project-specific requests as members look to make sure before they get the appropriation that they have the authorization. And so we get a lot more requests for what would an authorization core provide technical assistance to help shape the needed legislative language for this specific project. And so we have a lot of those types of requests too. So I think the world of earmarks has just sort of increased the number of requests on the core for technical assistance to Congress to help shape the legislation they're drafting.
I think I would like kind of to add, going back to the kind of how we communicate technical information like capabilities, and I think it puts a greater onus on the core to communicate more openly with non-federal sponsors, stakeholders, members of Congress, to help communicate what are really technical projects, technical information about capabilities, to take that extra step to tell that story about what those projects needs are. And kind of with earmarks, the member is putting themselves, their reputation behind certain projects and funding that they're bringing to their constituents. And so what we have kind of emphasized is open lines of communication with all parties. The chief likes to say delivering projects is a team business, and we can't do this alone. We do this with other people. And so ensuring that all of our stakeholders are aligned on what we're communicating about projects, their funding needs, and in Mr. Belk's language, he likes to say there shouldn't be any surprises. When capabilities change, which they might for changed project conditions or other factors that influences how projects are delivered, we should be in lockstep with our non-federal sponsors and our congressional stakeholders so that they know that these potential earmarks that they're putting their names behind will ultimately deliver what they want, but there's nuances that come with that delivery. And so kind of at the end of the day, we really try and focus with our congressional affairs team on quality communications, providing quality information, whether it's technical assistance, whether it's interactions with members, and in the essence of no surprises of why we're communicating the things we are.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. I can't wait for everybody to hear this edition of Inside the Castle. So again, we appreciate you and your insights. Until next time, be safe, be innovative, and continue doing great things.
Thanks for joining us for this Inside the Castle podcast. To provide your feedback, email us at cw.infrastructure.team@usace.army.mil. Stay tuned for additional Inside the Castle podcasts as we explore life inside the Corps and revolutionize civil works together.